Whenever I was incarcerated at the substance abuse treatment facility in Corcoran, California, the professor, the MAC rep who had the most authority on the yard amongst inmates, and myself set out with the intent of convincing the millionaire music producer Phil Spector to purchase a freezer to be installed in the canteen so that all the inmates on the yard, himself included, would be able to purchase ice cream. The first step to getting this done was going to be an informal conversation with Phil about whether it was something he was interested in having done. As it turned out, I ate breakfast with Phil most mornings, at least 3 or 4 days out of the week. He and I were both on the kosher meals program, meaning that we received food separate from the rest of the inmate population that had been prepackaged and then delivered directly to us in the chow hall. This meant that we had a couple of tables set aside where just the inmates who were on the KMP program ate. One of these tables was generally reserved for Phil, his friend, a sycophant type named Weaselson, who always did small chores for him, called him Sir or Mr. Spector, myself, and my friend Zip Tie. On this morning, whenever I sat down with Phil, Weaselson, and Zip Tie, it was pretty quiet, which was par for the course. Phil and Weaselson didn't talk all that much, and Zip Tie and I, though we were talkative, we weren't generally morning people. If he and I were going to have a conversation, we'd have it later in the day walking laps. On this morning, after I sat down, I said to Phil, "Hey Phil, I'd like to get at you for just 1 minute. I wanted to talk to you about something." And this was the type of thing that Phil would do. If he had an opportunity to make the people around him just a little bit smaller, to demonstrate that he had social capital, he'd always use it. He looked up at me and paused for just one moment and went, "Yeah, okay, I'll talk to you, but you're gonna have to wait until I'm done eating." And I was dismissed. He went back to his food. Of course, there was really nothing substantive or special there on his tray, so it was just a couple of moments before he looked up at me and went, "Yeah, Aaron, you have 1 minute. What do you want?" I didn't take offense. I told him, "Well, Phil, you know how you're always complaining that you'd like to be able to buy ice cream here on the canteen, that it's not fair that you got sent to the prison where inmates can't buy ice cream?" I went, "Yeah, it's not fair that..." And he went on his 30-second or 45-second rant about why he was upset about this. Once he calmed himself down, I interjected and told him, "Well, Phil, that's what I'm trying to tell you, is that I was speaking to the MAC rep, the professor, and he suggested that if somebody, yourself for instance, donated a freezer to the institution that was the right type of freezer, a big commercial freezer, and donated enough money to have that freezer installed on the yard, that there would be no reason that the administration wouldn't have this done and then everybody on the yard could buy ice cream." Once money came up, the tone shifted. Suddenly it was all business, and I could see that the 1-minute clock that Phil had going in his head to interrupt me and tell me my time was up, it was gone, and all of a sudden I was a person he was willing to talk to. "How much money are we talking?" I told him, "Well, Phil, I can't say exactly. It could be a lot. You want my best guess, it's going to be a lot more than it reasonably should be, because it's going to have to be the right commercial freezer from the right company, and they're going to have to use union labor to install it, and all those little details that make a government contract so much more expensive than something just John is doing in his backyard. That said, I don't expect it would be more than $10,000 or $15,000, and if this is something you are interested in, I can have the professor get the paperwork together and talk to you about it." Phil didn't have to think about it for long. You saw him do a couple little points of math in his head. "I'd be the guy who paid $10,000 for a cup of ice cream." And he did something then that I'd never heard him do before. Perhaps it was his trachea problems, or maybe it was just all of the evil, but his laugh was an eerie and sinister sound, and this was the first time I heard it. He went, "Ha, ha, ha." I guess he was amused at the profligate expense of $10,000 for ice cream. So I told him that I would talk to the professor and get back to him about it. Right around then, and it felt like they'd rehearsed it, the timing was so perfect, but I know they hadn't because I ate with them almost every morning. Weaselson came back to the table and looked at Phil and told him, "Sir, are you done with your tray? Can I get that for you?" And Phil told him, "Yeah, Aaron, your minute's up. I gotta go." And they were gone. Zip Tie and I took the opportunity to have a couple of words back and forth. I believe I made an appointment with him to share a spread and walk some laps sometime that weekend. I went back to my cell. This was a Saturday, and so I wasn't going to actually be able to see the professor at work until Monday. I didn't work on weekends. But as it turned out, both the professor, myself, and Phil had visits that weekend. The professor and I were regulars. We had family who lived close, and Phil, though his wife lived a significant distance away, she flew in every other week to visit him. Of course, while out in the visiting room, it wasn't like I was going to take the time to pull Phil and the professor off to the side, but I did bear in mind as I was going to my visit that if I had the opportunity, I could at least set up an appointment with the two of them. There is an interesting facet of prison visiting that many people may not be aware. There is a limited amount of space out in the visiting room. They generally have between 20 or 30 tables. However, there are more inmates who would like to receive visits on a given weekend, often, than they have space available. So, once the visiting room is full, every table has an inmate and his visitors, they'll make an announcement. Is anybody willing to double up? This means, are you willing to share your table with another inmate and his visitors? So myself and my wife would be sitting on one side of the table, and another inmate and his mother or whoever happened to be visiting him would be sitting on the other side of the table. You're not actually supposed to socialize. Crosstalk is discouraged and against the rules, but you are sharing a table. Given that all inmates are convicted felons, and many of them are monstrous, sadistic sociopaths, you put real thought into the consideration of who you would be willing to sit next to. There were some people who were a pleasure to sit next to. You actually developed a small social relationship with them. Zip Tie and his sister, who visited him regularly, were great people, and I actually ended up corresponding with him after I left the yard that I was on because we'd gotten to know each other pretty well in the visiting room. Conversely, there were other people who you simply would not be willing to sit next to. For instance, there was a serial killer on the yard there, E-Yard at SADF, named Roy Norris. On one occasion, they had asked my wife and I if we would be willing to sit next to Roy Norris, and we had had to tell the guards that, frankly, we'd rather just have our visit canceled, that we were unwilling to sit next to the guy because of how nasty he was. It was a line everybody had to draw for themselves. The professor and his wife were preferred people to sit next to. She was a paralegal. She worked in a law office, and she was a very well put together and intelligent young woman. The professor was also very well put together, polite, calm. It was never a hardship to sit next to them. On some occasions, we'd even have the opportunity to say, "So how you doing today, professor?" or "Hi, the professor's wife." On this occasion, I did sit across from the professor, but I neglected to take the time to say, "Hey, we need to talk about the freezer situation with Phil." Phil ended up processing out of the visiting room just a little bit before the visit ended, and I had other stuff that I was talking with my wife about. If we're being honest, I have no recollection about what specifically it might have been, but the prison visiting room is such a unique environment. Prison is a drab and gray place. There's very little color. Everything is bare concrete. The silver of the razor wire on the fence, perhaps, but by and large, it's a pretty dull place. and you step through a door into the visiting room and you're hit with the sound of the children playing in the side of the room and the smell of a microwaved burrito, the best non-prison food you've smelt in, well, however long since you had your last visit. You see all the visitors out there wearing their nice colorful clothes, smiling and laughing, and I've described it before as the moment in The Wizard of Oz, where the black and white fades away and everything is reborn in beautiful Technicolor. It's a magical place and time. I couldn't tell you what I talked with my wife about for the 6 hours that I was out there, some of it across from the professor, but I can tell you that it was the most important 6 hours of my week. Once the visit wraps up, everybody processes out. You go back into a concrete room, you all stand in a single file line, and the officer in charge of this inspects everybody and makes sure they're not smuggling any contraband back to the institution. They'll check your ears and your mouth, your hands, go through your clothes. They're making sure you don't have any drugs, perhaps a weapon that your visitor handed you, or even something as small as a handcuff key would be a really big deal. Once the officer had ascertained that neither myself nor the professor had any contraband on us, we were able to head back to the yard. Once we made it out the door, I told him, "Hey, Prof, let me get at you for just a minute." And I explained the situation about Phil. The professor decided we'd go talk to him right now. He had that kind of juice. He was the MAC rep. If he wanted to go to a building in the yard or a cell in the yard, well, he had that authority. We went to 5 Block, where Phil was, and the professor hollered up at the cop in the tower, "Hey, officer, let us go in and talk to inmate Spector." The officer had no problem with it. "Yeah, sure thing, professor. Look down YouTube channel? Sure thing, go in." Popped Phil out of his cell and called him over to sit at a table and talk to us. Phil would generally interject right early in a conversation. He liked to get the first word in, and there was no exception this time. Before he even sat down, he started talking. He said, "I know who you are. You're the professor. You're the MAC rep. How much is it going to cost for you to give me ice cream?" Though Phil may have been a little short, the professor was always very polite, put together, professional. He called Phil Mr. Spector, a sign of deference and respect, and outside of Weaselson, I don't know that I'd heard anybody else really approach Phil with respect. Phil responded well to it. He told him, "Well, Mr. Spector, I don't actually know exactly what it will cost to have a freezer installed on the yard, but I wanted to apprise you of the process and some specifics before I spoke to the warden about the bottom line. I can get you a form which you will fill out describing the freezer that you're donating and the amount of money that you're donating. The freezer will have to be a certain type, and there will have to be enough money to have the freezer installed here on this yard. Once you have done those things, you are no longer in control of those items. They belong to the prison. If the warden wants, he can install the freezer in the back of the officer's break room, and he can take the money and use it for a raise for himself. It's the prison's money. That said, if you were to donate a freezer and the correct amount of money to the institution, an informal understanding could be reached. After all, there's only so many places a freezer like that can be installed, and it could certainly be done on the yard you were on, so long as it's for the welfare of the inmate body as a whole. If you donate a big screen television to the institution, don't expect that you can have that TV put in your cell regardless of what kind of effort you might put into it. But something like a freezer that's obviously for everybody's benefit, I believe we can arrange that. Phil thought about it for a second. He repeated, "But what's the bottom line gonna be?" And the professor told him, "I'll have a meeting with the warden on Tuesday. I can get more information then, but I believe it will cost somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 to have this set up. Would you be interested in this?" Phil thought about it and said, "Yeah, $10,000 is nothing. I want ice cream." He paused for just a second, and I suppose that it occurred to him that he was in prison and $10,000 was actually something. You can't trust an inmate with that amount of money. So he looked up, looked the professor in the eyes, and said, "But my lawyers are going to be all over this. This had better be above the board." The professor didn't take offense. He kind of chuckled and went, "I assure you, Mr. Spector, this is all legitimate. I'm happy to talk to your lawyers about it." Phil wasn't curt enough to just stand up and walk away once the business had been resolved. Rather, we sat there for just a couple of moments and socialized, and then the professor and I got up and we left the building. He and I probably had a couple of words talking about how nice our visit had been or how we'd see each other at work on Monday. I went back to my building and he went back to his. I said that the 6 hours that I spent in the visiting room was the most important time of my week. And it really was. I did a lot of things in a week. I had a job as a clerk. I'm sure I exercised. I was taking college classes. I socialized and played games. But those 6 hours where I didn't have to be an inmate, rather I'd go out there and I'd get to be who I actually thought of myself as, a husband and a father, well, those were the most magical and important hours of my week because they allowed me to do all the other things that I needed to do throughout the week. It's where I got my strength, my humanity. In your everyday life, if you have something, that thing that keeps you sane and stable, that makes it so you can endure the rest of the week, don't undervalue it. Don't treat it as just that thing that you do to treat yourself and have fun. Whether it's a game you play, a friend you hang out with, or just spending time with your wife and kids. It's not just spending time with your wife and kids. That time whenever you get to be the person who you want to be and do the things that are important to you, that's where you get the strength and fortitude to plod through the rest of the week. So if you find yourself with the opportunity to take just a little bit of extra time and remind yourself of who you are, well, take that opportunity. Thank you for listening today.